Hey everybody, we are still waiting for a couple of people to join today's session. We won't take up the full hour, so we'll wait just a little bit longer for people to join. If you notice, you all will be in listen-only mode. This is because we've got several people joining, so we're going to be pretty quick today, but we'll give it just a few more minutes before we actually get started. While you wait, there is a PDF within the GoToMeeting panel if you want to download and print out the slides for today's session and make notes. Further, because you're all in listen-only mode, we want you to be able to ask questions as needed. So please make note of where the questions panel is. That will give you the ability to communicate directly with Shelley during the webinar. And then at the very end, if we've got time and we've got any questions that are pertinent to the whole group or anything that's asked multiple times, we'll take a few minutes to address any of those. So please make a note of that. And again, I thank you all for joining and for your patience. We will get started in just a few minutes. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I am Cecil King. I'm the presenter for today's session. We will be reviewing the newest features within Plume's version 5.1.12 product suite. This is the global periods and date last seen. I don't expect today's call to take more than about 20 minutes, so we should be able to give you a little bit of time back in your day. If you've just joined us, please notice there's a PDF within the GoToMeeting panel that you can download and print out if you wish to take any notes. And please make a note of the questions panel. All of you guys are in listen-only mode. That's because we've got several people on the call today. So you can actually use this to communicate directly with Shelley during the webinar for any questions or clarifications that you might need, or if you want somebody to follow up with you after the webinar for more pointed questions. So we will go ahead and get started with today's session. All right, so the goals for today, we are going to review the two new features in Plume. That's the global period and date last seen. We'll review the basics of how it's set up and how they all work. Then we'll go through some of the displays and some of the customizations clients can use for their particular setup. This includes how and if you decide to display information in the Excel capture form, how you can access this information in Excel Smart, how to build rules against some of this information, using the provider specialty to customize that display even further, how this information is actually updated so that you know when to expect to start seeing this information, and lastly, how you can import historical data if you wish. So let's start with what you need to have completed in order to start using these features. You must be upgraded to 5.1.12. During that setup, the archive option should activate and a SQL job will set up to actually process the information fully. This should all happen seamlessly during the upgrade, but we like to make sure that you know that that does have to happen for it to populate. But if you've got any concerns about that setup, support will be happy to do a double check for you. The last few items are more optional things that we expect clients to be interested in leveraging with the system. This is displaying this information in the form header of Excel Capture. You may also wish to load historical information for your patients from the practice management system or some other very reliable source for that information. You may also wish to write some custom rules against this information, and we'll review some options for each of these during today's webinar. Again, it'll be an overview of how to do all of these. It's not going to go really in depth. We've got a document that we can send you if you are interested in a little bit more of the nitty-gritty technical details of that. One other thing that I do want to mention before we dive in, we've already delivered all of the global periods per the AMA listing. This is within the White Plume setup, so you don't even have to worry about defining each of those global dates. First, let's go ahead and take a look at the form header in Excel Capture. I thought it was pretty easy to look at the screenshots to show you very quickly some of these options. You don't have to do this to start compiling the global period and date last seen information, but we do expect that most clients using Excel Capture will want to see this information form header somewhere. Your forms representative will be able to assist you with the setup and display that works best for your practice, whether these historical fields are linked or in separate fields or in separate tabs. If you're using specialties, then you can also define it to display those specialties with your date last seen. If you are not using specialties, then you may decide that that might be a helpful way to filter out what displays for the providers. We'll kind of dig into that a little bit later in the webinar. But let's go ahead and look at a couple of these form header options. Okay, so this first one that I want to point out, if you notice in the header, I'm going to use my mouse over here. We've got the global periods information displaying in the forms header. This looks very similar to your historical diagnosis section that many of our clients use and have been using. But these are in two separate tabs, and you'll notice you've got the CPT code, description, and then the date of expiration for that global period. Next to it is actually the date the patient was last seen. So it displays all of this information together. All right. It does take up a decent amount of room in the forms header, but it makes sure that all of that information is available immediately to the provider or user in Excel Capture. This might work best for you guys. Now, there's another option that might be helpful as well to kind of preserve a little bit more of that screen real estate in the forms header, and that would be putting the global period with the historical diagnosis. This is two separate tabs in the form, so the historical diagnosis would display first, and then the user could click over to display the global period information. Again, you've got the same information here, the CPT, description, and then the date of expiration for that global period, and then the last seen date over here. We've got an additional field displaying here. This is actually the provider specialty. As I mentioned earlier, if you use specialties, then you can define it to display that your patient last seen date. This particular provider that last saw the patient didn't have a specialty, so that's why the NA displays. All right. The last option that I want to show you takes up the absolute least amount of space possible on the forms header. You've got the last seen date and a tab separate from the global period and from the historical diagnosis information. Again, it'll display in whatever order you've got these tabs ordered, so you can work with your forms rep to decide, how you want this to display. Again, this takes up the least amount of room, but there might be a hybrid between some of these that might actually work best for you in your practice. Okay. All right, so let's move on over to Excel Smart and review the features here. So a new icon actually displays here. It's the historical procedure information. This actually starts populating after you start processing charges. So if I click on this field, you'll be able to see the global period information over to the left, and then the last seen information over to the right. This isn't customized, it displays by default, but the information starts displaying after you process charges. So you've got the end date of the global period, if there's a specialty associated, the procedure and description of that global CPT. The last seen date gives you the date that patient was last seen, and if there is a specialty defined for that provider that saw the patient, it'll display here as well. Okay, we close out. Notice we've also got some rules that are firing down below. So you can actually now start building rules against the global period or the date last seen. We've got a couple of examples of this down below that you might be interested in. This is to kind of help you get the wheels turning on what you might be able to do. So the first one that I want to look at is associated to the E&M. I'm going to expand both of these real quick. And then looks at the date last seen. I'm going to expand and look at the full maintenance so we can actually look at what was written in the rule expression. To me, I feel like this is very helpful for users to see that we define this to say when the procedure starts with a 9920, so it's looking at a new patient visit, but the patient was seen within the last 3 years. So this is telling the user, hey, this isn't a new patient. We need to, change that to an existing patient visit. All right. The second option that we've got down here is actually looking more at that global period versus the date of this ticket. So if I open this up, again, I like looking at the rule expression myself. So this is actually comparing that global date, the end date of the global period, so when that expires, versus the date of this particular encounter or this procedure code. Further than that, it's actually looking at it to say, well, did they even put the post-op on this encounter? So it's looking for that missing post-op code to say, hey, you might need to dig into this and look and make sure that we don't need to update this or put the post-op code on this encounter. All right. That's just two ideas that we've got at this point. There are several other options that you've got in terms of how you might want to tweak this, but this is just to get the wheels. Okay. Further, this, we've got a couple other attributes, different things that you can actually build the rules against. So the date last seen, the specialty of the last seen date, the global period code, the description, the end date, or even the specialty of that global period. You may already be getting a couple more ideas of rules, but if you're interested in some documentation about those globals or some additional rule ideas, use the chat window to communicate with Shelly. She'll be able to follow up with you and give you some more information on a couple of other examples that we've come up with so far. All right, now I want to go over the basics of how to set up the provider specialty. If you already have this set up in ePass support maintenance, then you know that that data is collected on a going forward basis. In other words, this is attached after a charge is processed through the White Plume suite. So verifying if you've got specialties already set up is really easy. Just log into ePass support maintenance. And you'll notice that there's a specialty column. Let me use my pointer to show you over here. You've got, if nothing is defined, then it's going to be that NA, it's blank, nothing is put on that provider for a specialty. Or you can actually see immediately that you've got some specialties defined for providers. Okay. Within the provider entry is where you actually define the specialty. So that's what this screen is. If you double click on the provider and you open up that entry, you've got the specialty defined here. It's a blank or free text field, but once you actually start adding specialties, it becomes a part of the drop down. That's what we're kind of showing right below the specialty, is that you can actually use those to assign multiple providers to the same specialty. Each provider has one entry that can be assigned to one specialty in the system. So in the example that we're looking at here, there's one entry for Rachel Chin, but she's got two provider codes. Both of these provider codes will be associated to that ophthalmology specialty, right? I do want to take this time to say that if you are not using specialties today and are interested in starting to use it, make sure you reach out to your client account executive or the support team to discuss any other nuances that might be pertinent to your setup. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, Plume delivers the global periods per AMA guidelines. You may wish to use a different global period than the one specified. You may wish to add other CPTs to the global date. This is done in EPAS configuration. Again, this is just for overriding the global dates provided by AMA. To add an override, you would go to the code configuration section, that's this section up here, then to the procedures, and then you've got the listing of all of your procedures that may go beyond the default settings for procedures. So that would also include anything that you want to override for global dates. You can actually see right here is where you would define that for a CPT code. And then as you add those, you would be able to see that available over on the right-hand side of the EPAS configuration screen. If you need a listing of the AMA dates, we're happy to provide that separately if you need it. So let us know if you do need a copy of that information. All right. We're getting close to the close of the webinar, but I do want to chat a little bit about how this information is updated in the White Plume system. After all the setup is done, and once you start completing charges from ExcellaSmart, the system begins to compile this information. However, it requires that overnight process I mentioned earlier to run in order for you to see that information within the system. Again, this runs automatically once it is set up, but it's important to know that you won't immediately see this information in White Plume. It'll take that overnight job after it's completed in ExcellaSmart for it to fully update the system. Right. This is the same for if you actually import historical information from your practice management system into White Plume as well. Some clients might be listening to this and saying, hey, I want to pull some of this historical CPT information from the last 3 years for that date last seen. You absolutely can do that with a spreadsheet and import it directly into EPAS support maintenance as well. We've got a document that actually goes through all of those details and how to specifically set that up and set up the spreadsheet and all of that information. So if you're interested in doing that, let us know and we'll be able to provide that information for you as well. But keep in mind, after you do import, you will still have to wait for that overnight process to run for it to fully populate that information in the system. Okay. All right, so folks, this concludes the global period and date last seen portion of the webinar. I do want to go over one last thing while we've got you on the call. We have one new feature that I know clients have been interested in for a long time, and this is the hard stop for critical rules. I mostly want to make sure that you know that this is another available feature in 5112, and just very briefly how this works. If you've been around a while, you probably know that within the validation manager, you can specify the severity of a rule. By default, most of our stuff is in the warning, but it's always been a kind of visual icon next to the rule and also a way to kind of filter down what types of rules are displaying in the validation window. Now you can actually set the system to prevent users from completing encounters if there is a critical rule still in the batch. So if you're configured for this, then the user will actually receive an error saying, hey, you can't complete this until the rule is addressed. This makes sure that the user addresses all of those critical rules. Further, if you need to allow for an override, a manager can use their own credentials to override the rule. Kind of think of this as the self-checkout at a grocery store. If you do something wrong, then you have to wait for an employee to come over, log in, and override the issue. It's a very similar process here. The manager will have to use their credentials and decide whether they want it to be just for this validation, for the whole batch, or if they want it to be for the whole session in ExcellaSmart. So that means until they exit out of ExcellaSmart, they would be able to still override that critical edit. So I want to make sure that I mention, we obviously don't want you to be overriding rules all of the time. So be deliberate about what critical rules you want to configure in your system to hard stop. Also, if you're interested in this, let CAE know and we'll follow up with you on this item as well. All All right, so that actually concludes today's session for global periods and date last seen. We can leave a couple more minutes here. Shelley, I don't know if you've gotten any major questions that we need to dig into at this point.
No, we don't have any for the good of the group, but I'm certainly still monitoring the question panel if there is anything, and we will follow up with them after we're done.
Okay. So we'll leave this open a little bit longer for those questions. You think?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Well, do we need to leave this open a little bit longer for those questions?
Yeah, we'll leave it open for just a couple of minutes after we're done, and then we will close it and follow up. Yep.
All right, and guys, just be sure if you need that document with the slides for today's session, be sure to grab that before you exit.
Thank you, guys. Hope y'all have a great day.
Thank you.